My beloved child. Something changed the moment those words were spoken, and the strange part is that nobody in the room expected them to carry so much weight. Until then, everything had looked almost ordinary from the outside. Your soulmate had been careful, measured, perhaps even quieter than usual whenever your name entered the conversation. The third party had grown comfortable with that silence. They assumed hesitation meant uncertainty. They believed distance meant the feelings were fading. And for a while, your soulmate allowed everyone to believe exactly that. But then one simple question was asked: if you already know how you feel, what are you waiting for? There was a pause. Not the kind of pause that comes from confusion, but the kind that appears when someone realizes they can no longer hide behind unfinished excuses. And then your soulmate said something nobody expected to hear so clearly: I don't want to keep wasting time. If this is real, I want to build something lasting with them. That sentence changed the atmosphere. Suddenly, the third party understood that this was no passing emotion. This was no temporary attachment that could be talked away. Something had matured quietly while everyone else was watching the surface. Don't skip, because the reason your soulmate reached this point is not what the third party assumed, and it may not be what you assume either. The desire to marry you quickly did not begin with impatience. It began with recognition. Your soulmate started noticing something about you that became impossible to overlook. When life became complicated, thoughts of you did not disappear. They became clearer. When distractions arrived, your importance did not shrink. It became easier to understand. And somewhere in that realization, your soulmate began asking a question that changed everything: why am I treating something meaningful as though I have endless time to decide? That question followed them into quiet moments. It appeared while they were doing ordinary things. It returned when they tried to focus on completely unrelated matters. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Just steadily. Like a truth waiting to be acknowledged. The third party noticed the shift before they understood it. Your soulmate stopped defending their feelings so much. They stopped explaining themselves. They became strangely calm whenever your future was mentioned. That calmness unsettled the third party more than an argument ever could, because arguments can sometimes be redirected. Certainty is different. Certainty does not always need to raise its voice. Sometimes it simply stops asking permission. And that is where the third party lost control of the conversation. They tried to remind your soulmate of every possible reason to slow down. They mentioned timing. They mentioned complications. They asked whether marriage was really necessary to think about already. Your soulmate listened. That may be the most surprising part. They did not become angry. They did not dismiss anyone. They listened carefully, and then said, "Those are fair questions. But none of them change what I know about this person." Imagine the silence after that sentence. Because suddenly, the discussion was no longer about whether feelings existed. It was about how seriously your soulmate had begun taking them. Stay till the end, because something important is waiting for you inside the reason this certainty grew so quickly. It was not because you were perfect. In fact, one of the deepest realizations your soulmate had was almost the opposite. They had seen enough of you to understand that you were real. You had your quiet moments, your guarded moments, your times when you questioned yourself. You did not always know the perfect thing to say. And somehow, that made the connection feel more trustworthy rather than less. Your soulmate began imagining what life would feel like without the performance, without pretending everything had to be extraordinary every day. They imagined mornings where nothing dramatic happened. Long drives. Small disagreements followed by understanding. Ordinary dinners. Tired evenings. Shared plans changing at the last minute. Celebrations nobody else would fully understand. And when they pictured those simple things, something inside them became surprisingly peaceful. That is when the idea of marriage stopped feeling like a distant fantasy and started feeling like a possible home. But here is where the story takes a quieter turn. The third party believed your soulmate wanted to rush because they were afraid of losing you. Your soulmate knew that was not entirely true. There may have been a natural concern that opportunities can pass when people remain silent too long, but underneath that was something stronger. They were becoming less afraid of choosing. For a long time, your soulmate may have believed that the safest life was the life where every possibility remained open. Never commit too soon. Never reveal too much. Never place the heart somewhere it could truly matter. Yet eventually they noticed the cost of living that way. Keeping every door open can also mean never walking fully through the one that matters. And your presence became the door they could no longer pretend not to see. Something important began forming in their thoughts. Not, how do I make this person belong to me, but, how do I become someone capable of building something healthy with them? That distinction matters. Because real commitment is not simply wanting another person close. It is deciding to show up differently yourself. Your soulmate started looking inward. They noticed habits they would need to change. Conversations they had avoided. Responsibilities they could no longer postpone. They began thinking about stability, patience, communication, and the kind of partner they actually wanted to become. The third party saw some of these changes but misunderstood them. They thought your soulmate was pulling away from everyone. In reality, your soulmate was becoming more selective with their energy. They were tired of letting outside voices make private decisions for them. And then one evening, something small happened that brought everything into focus. Your name came up unexpectedly. There was no dramatic announcement. Someone simply mentioned you in passing, perhaps remembering something you had said or done. Your soulmate smiled before they could stop themselves. It was brief. Almost invisible. But the third party saw it. You still feel that strongly? They asked. Your soulmate looked away for a second and answered, stronger. Just quieter. That was the moment the third party realized they had been reading the silence completely wrong. Silence had not meant the connection was disappearing. Silence had meant your soulmate was thinking more seriously than ever. And now comes the part that heaven, in the symbolic language of this story, seems to illuminate not as a supernatural guarantee, not as a command, but as a deeper perspective. Sometimes the clearest relationships are not the ones surrounded by constant drama. Sometimes they are the ones that quietly invite two people to become more honest, more mature, more peaceful, and more intentional. Your soulmate began recognizing that being drawn toward you was not only about excitement. It was about who they noticed themselves becoming whenever they imagined a future where love required responsibility. That realization humbled them. Suddenly marriage was not a trophy at the end of a romantic story. It was a promise they would have to live inside every day. And strangely, instead of frightening them away, that responsibility made them want to move closer. Because there was something about you they had not fully appreciated before. You did not simply make them imagine being loved. You made them imagine becoming dependable. Read that feeling carefully. There is a difference between someone who wants your attention and someone who starts reorganizing their priorities because they can see you beside them in the future. The third party began noticing it too. Plans that once sounded vague became specific. Your soulmate spoke differently about next year. They became more conscious of where they wanted to live, what kind of home they wanted, how they wanted to spend their time, and which relationships in their life genuinely supported growth. Your name was not inserted into every sentence. That would have been obvious. Instead, you appeared between the sentences. In the assumptions. In the future tense. In the quiet way they began saying, "we," and then catching themselves. Something important is waiting for you, because the most meaningful reason has not been revealed yet. Your soulmate's urgency did not come from a single romantic moment. It came from a contrast. They remembered who they were before understanding what they felt for you, and then they noticed how differently they experienced certain things afterward. Before, they could imagine walking away from meaningful connection simply because vulnerability felt inconvenient. With you, walking away no longer felt like strength. It felt like avoiding a conversation they were finally ready to have. Before, they wanted certainty before making any move. Now they understood that healthy commitment does not come with every answer prepared. Sometimes two people choose to learn the answers together. And that changed your soulmate's definition of readiness. They stopped asking, "Can I guarantee everything will be perfect?" and began asking, "Am I willing to protect something good through imperfect moments?" That was the question that settled something inside them. The third party still could not understand. "Why now?" they finally asked. Your soulmate remained quiet for several seconds. Then came the answer they had apparently been holding back, "Because I finally understand what I would regret." Notice how different that is from desperation. Your soulmate was not saying they could not live without you. They were saying they did not want to look back and realize fear had made an important decision for them. They did not want hesitation to become a habit. They did not want pride to speak where honesty belonged. And they did not want you to spend forever guessing whether you had truly mattered. That answer disarmed the room. Even the third party had nothing immediate to say. Because beneath every disagreement, they could hear something sincere. Your soulmate was no longer talking about chasing a feeling. They were talking about choosing a direction. And there was one more sentence. A sentence spoken so softly that almost everyone missed its importance. Your soulmate said, "I think they've been waiting to see whether my actions will ever match my feelings." That realization went deeper than anything else. Because suddenly your soulmate understood that saying they cared was not enough anymore. You may have heard beautiful words before. You may have seen moments of closeness followed by uncertainty. Perhaps part of you learned to protect your heart by watching what people consistently do instead of becoming carried away by what they temporarily say. Your soulmate sensed that. And instead of resenting your caution, they began respecting it. They realized that if they wanted a future with you, they would need to make that future believable through patience, clarity, and consistency. This is where the title becomes more meaningful. Wants to marry you right away does not have to mean rushing past wisdom. It can mean that inside your soulmate, the direction has become clear even if the practical journey still deserves care. They are no longer wondering whether commitment belongs somewhere in the future. They are wondering what it would take to approach it properly. And heavens, why, within this reflective story, is surprisingly simple. The connection stopped feeling like something your soulmate wanted merely to experience, and began feeling like something worth taking responsibility for. But there is another layer beneath even that. One the third party still does not know. Because after that conversation ended, your soulmate did something alone that revealed more than anything they had said aloud. No one instructed them. No one witnessed the beginning of it. They opened something connected to you, something they had kept for longer than anyone realized, and when they saw what was there, they finally understood why the thought of marrying you had become so difficult to dismiss. What they found was not dramatic. It was far more personal than that. And the meaning hidden inside it is where everything begins to change. The object in your soulmate's hands looked almost meaningless at first, and that was exactly why the memory attached to it struck so deeply. It was something ordinary, something another person could have glanced at and forgotten within seconds. A saved message, an old photograph, a small note, a quiet reminder from a moment neither of you realized would matter this much later. Your soulmate had kept it without making a conscious decision to keep it. It had simply remained. Through changing moods, complicated conversations, silence, uncertainty, and every attempt to convince themselves that perhaps they should stop thinking so far ahead, this one small reminder had stayed exactly where they left it. And when they opened it after the conversation with the third party, they noticed something they had overlooked before. The memory was not connected to one of your most impressive moments. It was connected to one of your simplest. You had said something kind when there was nothing to gain from saying it. You had noticed something about them that almost everyone else missed. Maybe you remembered a detail they had forgotten telling you. Maybe you offered calm instead of judgment. Maybe you simply listened at a moment when they expected to be interrupted. Whatever the exact detail, your soulmate suddenly understood why that memory had survived everything else. It represented the way they felt around you when neither of you was trying to prove anything. And that feeling was unexpectedly powerful. Don't skip, because this is where your soulmate's desire for marriage begins becoming less about romance and more about recognition. They stared at that old reminder and thought about how much of life is actually made from moments exactly like that. Not dramatic declarations. Not perfect days. Not constant excitement. Life is built from ordinary Tuesdays, unfinished conversations, tired evenings, small acts of patience, and the quiet decision to keep caring when nobody is applauding. Your soulmate realized that when they imagined those ordinary moments, you were the person they could most naturally picture beside them. That realization did not arrive like lightning. It settled slowly. Almost gently. And somehow that made it harder to dismiss. Your soulmate had experienced strong emotions before. They knew excitement could be intense and still temporary. They knew chemistry could feel powerful without necessarily creating compatibility. They knew people could say extraordinary things in emotional moments and then struggle to live those words consistently afterward. But what they were feeling with you had survived quieter seasons. It had remained even when there was nothing dramatic happening to feed it. That difference began to matter. They placed the object down, picked it up again, and smiled at something they remembered. Then came a thought that made them sit completely still. If the smallest moments with this person are the ones I keep remembering, what would a whole life of those moments feel like? There was no immediate answer. There did not need to be. The question itself opened something. For the first time, marriage stopped appearing in their imagination as one enormous event surrounded by celebration. They pictured everything after it. Grocery lists. Late breakfasts. Learning each other's routines. Discovering which side of the bed each person naturally chooses. Laughing over something ridiculous nobody else would understand. Supporting one another through demanding weeks. Giving each other space without confusing space with distance. Apologizing properly after misunderstandings. Making plans and changing them. Growing older while still discovering new things about the person beside you. These images were not glamorous, yet they created a deeper feeling than glamour ever had. Stay till the end, because the third party is about to hear something your soulmate had never admitted aloud, and it explains why their reaction became so emotional. The following day, the subject returned. The third party had not forgotten the previous conversation. In fact, they had spent hours trying to understand it. They expected your soulmate's certainty to weaken after sleeping on it. Instead, something had become even calmer. "Are you seriously thinking about marriage?" the third party asked. Your soulmate did not answer quickly. They looked thoughtful, almost as though they were deciding whether this person had earned access to something private. Finally they said, "I'm seriously thinking about what kind of life I want. Marriage is part of that." The third party pushed further. But why them? There it was. The question everyone eventually asks when they cannot understand a connection from the outside. Why this person? Why not someone easier? Why not someone more convenient? Why not wait? Your soulmate could have listed your qualities. They could have spoken about your personality, your loyalty, your humor, your way of seeing things. Instead, they answered with something much more revealing, because around them, I don't feel like I have to become somebody else before I'm worthy of being understood. The third party went silent. Your soulmate continued. They don't make me want to pretend I have everything figured out. They make me want to actually figure things out. That distinction changed everything. There are people who inspire performance, and there are people who inspire growth. Performance says, I need to look perfect so you will choose me. Growth says, I want to become better because what we could build deserves my effort. Your soulmate was beginning to recognize that you belonged to the second category. Even your boundaries had taught them something. The moments when you did not chase, over-explain, or constantly prove your value had forced your soulmate to look inward. Perhaps at first they misunderstood that. They may have wondered whether you cared less than they did. Eventually they realized something different. you were showing them that connection should not require one person to abandon themselves to keep another person interested. That realization quietly reshaped the way they thought about partnership. They did not want to marry someone who would disappear inside the relationship. They wanted a person who could stand beside them with a life, a voice, an identity, and dreams of their own. And the more they pictured that kind of partnership, the more often your face appeared naturally inside it. Something important is waiting for you, because the third party did not react strongly simply because marriage was mentioned. They reacted because they suddenly understood that your soulmate had changed the rules of the situation. Until this point, the third party believed they could influence the outcome by keeping your soulmate uncertain. A little doubt here. A cautious question there. A reminder of past disappointments. Nothing openly harmful, perhaps, but enough to keep decisions postponed. Yet your soulmate had stopped outsourcing their judgment. They were willing to hear opinions without automatically obeying them. That independence unsettled the third party. "You're changing everything because of this person," they said. Your soulmate looked at them carefully. "No," they replied. "I'm changing things because I finally know what matters to me." The difference was subtle but enormous. You were not controlling your soulmate's choices. You had simply become part of the clarity that helped them make choices for themselves. Your soulmate continued, "I used to think keeping everyone comfortable meant I was being thoughtful. Sometimes it just meant I was avoiding decisions." The third party had no easy response. Because those words exposed something larger than the relationship itself. Your soulmate was entering a season where pleasing everyone could no longer be the guiding principle. They wanted to make choices they could respect later, even if those choices were not universally understood now. The conversation softened after that. Nobody needed to win. Your soulmate did not need the third party to agree. That was another sign of how much had changed. When a decision is still fragile, people often defend it loudly. When it becomes deeply considered, sometimes there is less need to defend it at all. Your soulmate simply said, "I know there are things we would need to talk about. I know you don't build a marriage from feelings alone. But I would rather have those conversations than keep pretending I don't know what direction I want." That was perhaps the most mature thing they had said yet. They were not imagining that commitment magically removes every question. They were choosing to become curious about those questions together. How would you handle conflict? What kind of future would you both want? How would responsibilities be shared? What values would matter most inside your home? How much independence would each person need? What traditions would you create? What would support look like when one person was struggling? Your soulmate began thinking about these things not because something was wrong, but because the idea of you had become real enough to deserve practical thought. And somewhere inside that practicality came one unexpectedly emotional realization: they did not only want to be present for your best moments. They wanted to become trustworthy enough that you would feel safe showing them the complicated ones too. That thought returned to the old memory they had opened the night before. Perhaps that was what you had offered them once without realizing it, a moment where they could be imperfect without being diminished. And your soulmate understood that if they ever became your spouse, they wanted to give that same gift back to you repeatedly. Not to rescue you. Not to complete you. Simply to create a relationship where neither person had to hide every unfinished part of themselves. Then something curious happened. The third party asked one final question, quieter this time. What if they say they aren't ready? Your soulmate's face changed. Not with panic. Not with disappointment. With respect. Then I'll respect that, they said. Wanting a future with someone doesn't mean I get to decide the timing for both of us. That answer revealed more than any dramatic declaration could have. Your soulmate wanted marriage, but they were beginning to understand that genuine commitment cannot be built through pressure. It requires two free choices moving toward the same place. And because your soulmate respected you, they wanted your choice to be real. They wanted you to choose them because the relationship felt right to you, not because you were swept into their urgency. That is where the word "right away" takes on a deeper meaning. Their heart may have stopped postponing the truth, but their actions still needed wisdom. Their internal decision had accelerated. The relationship itself still deserved patience. Heaven's symbolic message here was not "rush." It was "be honest." Stop treating sincere feelings like something embarrassing. Stop assuming delay automatically equals wisdom. Stop hiding behind endless maybe when your heart is asking you to have a real conversation. Your soulmate began understanding that clarity and rushing are not the same thing. A person can know where they hope to go while still walking carefully. And that became their plan. They would not appear suddenly with impossible expectations. They would begin with honesty. One meaningful conversation. One moment where nothing had to be performed. They wanted to tell you something they had avoided saying because saying it would make the future feel real. When I imagine building a life with someone, I keep imagining you. Even thinking those words made your soulmate nervous. Strange, isn't it? They could discuss marriage with another person, but imagining saying the truth directly to you felt entirely different. Because your response mattered. They began rehearsing possibilities in their mind. What if you smiled? What if you became quiet? What if you needed time? What if you asked questions they were not prepared to answer? And then they stopped rehearsing. They realized they did not need to control the conversation. They simply needed to enter it honestly. That evening they returned again to the old reminder connected to you, but this time they discovered another detail. Something they had forgotten completely. Attached to the memory was a date. And when they saw it, they realized that the moment had happened much earlier than they thought. Long before they admitted how strongly they cared. Long before the third party began questioning the relationship. Long before marriage ever crossed their mind. Somehow, even back then, something in them had already recognized you as important enough to remember. Your soulmate stared at that date and whispered a question into the silence. How long have I actually known? That question opened another memory. Then another. A pattern began forming, small moments stretching backward through time, each one showing that their feelings had not appeared suddenly at all. They had been building quietly while your soulmate was calling them something else. Friendship. Curiosity. Timing. Concern. Connection. Maybe even confusion. But underneath those different names was one continuous thread they had never fully examined. And now that they could see the pattern, one memory stood apart from all the others. It involved a conversation between you and your soulmate that seemed almost insignificant when it happened. You had said only a few words before changing the subject. Your soulmate had laughed and moved on. Yet those words had stayed somewhere deep in their mind. Tonight, for the first time, they understood what you were actually trying to tell them. And when that meaning finally became clear, your soulmate realized there was something you might have been waiting for them to understand all along. The meaning had been hiding inside an ordinary sentence for far longer than your soulmate realized. At the time, you had said it lightly, almost casually, as if you were protecting something deeper by making it sound simple. You had told them, "I just want people to be clear with me. I can handle the truth better than confusion." Then you changed the subject. No dramatic pause. No demand. No attempt to make them feel guilty. You simply moved forward. Your soulmate had smiled and continued the conversation, never understanding that those few words were revealing exactly what you needed most from anyone who hoped to remain close to you. Now, looking back, they could finally hear the message beneath the message. You had never been asking for perfection. You had been asking for clarity. You did not need somebody who always knew exactly what to do. You needed somebody brave enough to say what they meant, consistent enough to let their actions support it, and mature enough not to leave you interpreting endless mixed signals. That realization landed quietly, but it changed the shape of everything. Your soulmate began replaying moments when they had done precisely the opposite. Times when they cared deeply but behaved cautiously. Times when they wanted to move closer but became distant because vulnerability made them uncomfortable. Times when they assumed you would somehow understand feelings they had never clearly expressed. And suddenly, instead of wondering why you may have become more guarded, they understood. Perhaps you were never asking them to chase harder. Perhaps you were waiting to see whether they could become clear. Don't skip, because this is where their thoughts about marriage take another unexpected turn. Your soulmate realized that wanting to marry you meant very little if they could not first learn how to communicate with you honestly. A future could not be built from assumptions. A promise could not replace everyday reliability. They did not want to give you one magnificent declaration and then return to old patterns. They wanted to become the kind of person whose ordinary behavior would make the declaration believable. So instead of dreaming only about rings, ceremonies, photographs, or the excitement surrounding a proposal, they began imagining the conversation that should come before all of it. A simple conversation where they would sit across from you without performance and finally explain what had been happening inside them. "I know I haven't always been easy to understand," they imagined saying. "I know I've probably made you question whether I was serious. But somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about whether I wanted you in my life and started thinking about what kind of life we could actually build together." Even rehearsing those words made them uncomfortable, because they were more exposed than anything your soulmate normally allowed themselves to say. Yet instead of escaping the feeling, they stayed with it. That was new. Something in them understood that vulnerability was not a problem to solve. It was part of loving another person honestly. And when they thought about you hearing those words, they did not imagine you immediately promising forever. They imagined you listening. Maybe carefully. Maybe skeptically. Maybe with emotion you would try not to show. That possibility made them realize something else: you might need evidence before you needed promises. So your soulmate asked themselves a question that went much deeper than, how do I convince them? They asked, what would make them feel respected? The answer did not come from grand gestures. It came from consistency. Speak when something matters. Follow through on small things. Do not disappear when conversations become uncomfortable. Admit mistakes without turning every apology into a defense. Listen to your boundaries without treating them as rejection. Ask questions instead of making assumptions. Give affection without using affection to avoid difficult topics. Keep your own identity while making room for yours. Your soulmate sat with that list in their mind and realized that marriage was asking them to mature before it was asking them to celebrate. Strangely, that made the idea feel more meaningful, not less. Something important is waiting for you, because while your soulmate was having this realization, the third party was having one of their own. Until now, the third party had viewed your influence through the wrong lens. They had assumed you were somehow pulling your soulmate away from the life they already knew. But watching them become more thoughtful, more decisive, and more self-aware made that explanation harder to maintain. The third party remembered who your soulmate had been during earlier relationships or earlier chapters of life. Someone who often avoided uncomfortable decisions until circumstances made the decisions for them. Someone who kept people close partly because saying goodbye felt difficult. Someone who sometimes mistook peacekeeping for peace. Yet now your soulmate was beginning to say things clearly, even when clarity created temporary discomfort. That shift could not simply be blamed on romance. Something deeper had been activated. The third party noticed this when another conversation unfolded a few days later. They were not even talking about you at first. The subject was something unrelated: a commitment your soulmate had been postponing, a responsibility they needed to handle, perhaps a decision they had avoided because too many people had different opinions. In the past, your soulmate would have delayed again. This time they said, I already know what I need to do. I'm just nervous about doing it. The third party looked at them strangely and asked, since when do you talk like that? Your soulmate laughed. Since I got tired of confusing fear with uncertainty. That sentence remained in the room. Because it was not only about that one decision. It was about everything. Your soulmate had spent years believing that feeling afraid meant they did not know what they wanted. Now they were discovering that you can know exactly what you want and still feel nervous about moving toward it. Marriage had become one of those things. Loving you seriously had become another. The third party finally asked the question they had been avoiding, did this person change you? Your soulmate thought carefully before answering. No. But knowing them made it harder to ignore the parts of myself I needed to change. That answer softened something. Even the third party could hear the difference. You were not being placed on a pedestal. You were not being described as some magical solution to every problem. Your soulmate was saying that the connection had become a mirror. Through you, they had noticed their own avoidance, their own desire for deeper commitment, their own ability to choose differently. And suddenly the third party's resistance became less intense. Not gone. But less certain. Because the more they listened, the more they understood that your soulmate was not being swept away by fantasy. They were becoming more grounded. Stay till the end, because what happened next revealed the real reason your soulmate now feels such urgency to stop wasting time. One evening, they attended a small gathering where several couples were present. Nothing extraordinary happened. People talked, laughed, shared food, moved between conversations. But your soulmate began noticing tiny details. One person automatically brought their partner a glass of water without being asked. Another remembered a story their spouse had already told and still listened with interest. Someone quietly adjusted plans because their partner looked tired. Nobody applauded these things. Most people probably did not even notice them. Your soulmate did. And something inside them shifted. They had always associated commitment with major milestones. Suddenly they were seeing that lasting love might be made from thousands of almost invisible choices. Remembering. Noticing. Showing up. Making room. Offering patience. Choosing kindness when nobody is watching. Your soulmate found themselves thinking about you again. They remembered all the small things you had done that they once underestimated. The way you noticed changes in their mood. The way you remembered details they mentioned once. The way you sometimes gave them space instead of forcing conversation. The way your humor appeared at exactly the right moment. The way you could challenge them without making them feel small. And then a realization surfaced that almost embarrassed them because it was so simple. They had already experienced pieces of the partnership they wanted. They had simply been too focused on dramatic signs to recognize them. That evening, driving home or sitting alone afterward, your soulmate felt an unfamiliar combination of peace and urgency. Peace because the answer inside them felt increasingly clear. Urgency because they suddenly understood how easily meaningful things can be postponed while people wait for a perfect moment that never arrives. Not fear. Not panic. Just awareness. Life keeps moving. People change. Opportunities to speak honestly do not remain open forever. And your soulmate did not want another year to pass with both of you wondering what might have happened if one person had simply been brave enough to start the real conversation. They thought again about your sentence, "I can handle the truth better than confusion." This time, they smiled. "Then I owe them the truth," they whispered. Not ownership. Not pressure. Truth. They wanted to tell you that marriage had entered their thoughts. They wanted to tell you that when they pictured commitment now, your name was there. They wanted to tell you that they understood such a conversation might surprise you and that you were allowed to take your time. Most importantly, they wanted to stop making you interpret silence. And this is where heaven's why, as the deeper symbolic layer of this story, becomes clearer. Sometimes what feels like divine timing is simply the moment a person becomes mature enough to recognize what has been patiently standing in front of them. Your soulmate may have needed distance from old habits, uncomfortable self-reflection, conversations they did not enjoy, and even the third party's resistance to understand one fundamental truth: choosing someone is not the loss of every other possibility. It can be the beginning of becoming more intentional about the possibility that matters most. Your soulmate used to imagine that commitment meant closing doors. Now they were beginning to see another side. Commitment also opens doors that casual uncertainty never can. The door to deeper trust. The door to building traditions. The door to learning another person across years instead of moments. The door to becoming known beyond first impressions. The door to creating something that has enough stability to grow. This did not make your soulmate unrealistic. If anything, it made them more practical. They started thinking less about forever as a beautiful word and more about tomorrow as a responsibility. What could they do tomorrow that would make them more trustworthy? What conversation needed to happen? What habit needed attention? What promise should they stop making if they were not prepared to keep it? What part of themselves needed healing through honest effort rather than avoidance? The more they asked these questions, the more serious their desire to marry you became. Because now it was rooted not only in wanting to receive love, but in wanting to become capable of sustaining it. The third party witnessed some of this transformation and finally said something nobody expected. Maybe I misunderstood what was happening. Your soulmate looked surprised. The third party continued, I thought you were rushing toward them. But you're actually slowing down and thinking more than I've ever seen you think. There was a long silence. Then your soulmate answered, That's because I'm not trying to win them. I'm trying to understand whether I'm ready to build with them. Those words changed the entire tone between them. The third party did not suddenly become your biggest supporter. Human feelings rarely change that neatly. But something important had shifted. Resistance was no longer based on the belief that your soulmate was acting irrationally. They could see care. They could see thoughtfulness. They could see that your soulmate had considered your freedom as much as their own desire. And that made it much harder to dismiss the connection as temporary emotion. Then came the question that startled your soulmate. If you had the chance to tell them one thing tonight, what would you say? Your soulmate looked down. For once, there was no rehearsed answer. No clever phrase. No attempt to sound impressive. After a while they said, I would tell them I'm sorry I made something simple feel complicated. The third party waited. Your soulmate continued, I cared. I got scared. I overthought everything. And somewhere in all of that, they probably had to wonder if they imagined what was between us. Their voice softened. They didn't imagine it. That admission was perhaps the most emotionally honest thing your soulmate had said yet. Because beneath the dream of marriage was another desire. They wanted to restore clarity to a connection that may have been clouded by too much hesitation. They wanted you to know that your intuition had not been foolish. That certain moments mattered to them too. That the warmth you noticed was real. That the conversations they remembered were not one-sided memories. That the small details you held onto had been held somewhere inside them as well. Not every silence was indifference. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes confusion. Sometimes simply a person trying to understand feelings they did not yet know how to carry well. But your soulmate was no longer satisfied with leaving you to guess which silence meant what. That was the old version of them. The version considering marriage wanted to communicate differently. And then the third party said something that stopped them completely. What if they stopped waiting? The room seemed quieter after that question. Your soulmate did not answer immediately because it touched the one possibility they had been carefully avoiding. Maybe you had reached a place where your life was moving forward regardless of what they decided. Maybe you were no longer emotionally standing in the same spot where they last left you. Maybe you had learned that waiting indefinitely for clarity was unfair to yourself. And instead of making your soulmate angry, the possibility created respect. "Then I'll have to accept that," they said finally. "But I still think they deserve to know." That answer revealed growth again. Your soulmate was not preparing to speak because they believed honesty guaranteed the outcome they wanted. They were preparing to speak because honesty had become necessary regardless of outcome. That difference matters deeply. Real vulnerability does not say, "I will be truthful only if you promise to reward me." It says, "This matters enough that I would rather be genuine than protected." And somewhere in that willingness, your soulmate became more ready for marriage than any fantasy could have made them. Later that night, alone again, they opened the old message one final time. But instead of rereading only your sentence about clarity, they scrolled slightly farther. There was another message immediately beneath it, one your soulmate had completely forgotten. They had written it. Their own words. And when they saw what they had said to you back then, they felt their breath catch for a second. Because long before they were willing to admit they wanted a future with you, they had already made a quiet promise. Not a marriage promise. Something smaller. Something almost innocent. They had written, "One day, when I stop overthinking everything, I'll tell you what I really think about us." Your soulmate stared at the sentence for a long time. The date beside it made everything feel even stranger. Months had passed. Maybe longer. Life had moved. Conversations had changed. Yet there it was, the unfinished promise waiting patiently inside an old thread. Your soulmate laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because the person they used to be had apparently left a message for the person they had finally become. One day. They had written those words then. And tonight, for the first time, they realized something almost impossible to ignore. That day might have arrived. But before they could decide what to do next, another notification appeared on the screen. Your name was connected to it somehow, not necessarily a message from you, but something that made your soulmate sit upright and look twice. Because what they saw suggested that your life might be changing sooner than they thought. And suddenly, the conversation they had been planning no longer felt like something they wanted to postpone.